Studios, Ayo Johnson, who's an Africa Affairs analyst based here in London. Judging by this first day of testimony, he's certainly begun his defence all guns blazing.
Absolutely. Clearly he's a good speaker, he's very confident, but he's going to be found wanting sooner or later because the crucial questions have got to be asked, and I'm hoping that the prosecution would do so.
So you think the prosecution have a strong case against Charles Taylor?
Well, the thing about Charles Taylor is that he's been one of these guys where he's been so up the pecking order that it's been very difficult to show the distinction between him and the smaller generals on the ground who are actually carrying out a lot of these atrocities.
I'm joined by Ayo Johnson, an analyst of African affairs based here in London. Of course, we've just heard from a lawyer. It could be difficult proving that circumstantial evidence is enough to build the case against him.
Absolutely. Charles Taylor has surrounded himself with one of the best lawyers you could think about. He's got a very good, solid team around him. He himself is a very good speaker, and the evidence that we've seen thus far is not rock solid, and I'm afraid it's going to take time. Over time, we may be able to see whether he's found guilty or not.
This is Aljazeera.
Joining me now from London is Ayo Johnson, a specialist in African affairs who's researched China's investments there. Thank you very much. Ayo Johnson, the question was asked a bit earlier in Harry Mutasa's report, if this is a fair deal, whether Africans are getting as much out of dealing with China as the Chinese are.
Well, that's a very good question. The reality is that Africans need element of trade, and the Chinese have been willing to do so. They've expanded, as you've notably mentioned in your report, excessively so across the African continent, which has been quite a good thing, because Africans clearly need that exchange. The question has always been, what is the level of impact that this change is happening? I think in the case of Zimbabwe that you've clearly mentioned, China has, like all other donors, have to meet up to their responsibilities to ensure that the pledges that are made are equivalent to receipts on the ground.
Well, joining us now from London is the African Affairs Specialist, Ayo Johnson. Thanks for being with us. Can you contextualise the migration patterns within Africa? How much movement is there, and how much do people there rely upon being able to cross borders in search of work?
Well, large numbers of people are desperate. Their economies haven't worked. They've got issues within their countries, and as a matter of survival, large numbers of them across the continent are moving to countries which they think are far more affluent than the ones from which they first came from. And South Africa is one of many.
As Haru pointed out there, to a large extent, the South African government benefits from this globalisation. It can get cheap workers to work on the infrastructure necessary for the World Cup. But to what extent do they actually prepare for that movement of workers, and to what extent do they provide for it? Because they benefit from the cheapness of the labour, but do they actually make sure that the labour is treated properly?
Well, the one thing that Zuma had, the problems he's got currently, is that he's in a tug of war with the unions. And the unions in South Africa are desperate to ensure that there's fair terms for their workers and there's security for jobs for those South Africans in that country. And the influx of individuals from other parts of the world or other parts of Africa only puts pressure on the South African government. My concern is, more than likely, they would more than likely want to impose draconian measures to curtail the numbers of people coming to their country. And it wouldn't surprise me for us to see that happen very soon. We've seen that large numbers of MPs in that country actually calling for such measures, because it's going to put significant strain on their healthcare systems, significant strain on their other facilities, and the South African government is going through a recession, and they're not in the mood currently to accept an influx of large numbers of people.
Well, for more on that now, I'm joined by Ayo Johnson, who's a specialist on African affairs based in London. Thanks very much for joining us. First of all, this deal between China and Guinea, a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it all depends on how you look at it. Clearly, Guinea needs the element of investment, and of course China is willing to do so. China has this relationship with Africa, and of course Guinea is no exception, where they exchange raw materials, provide access, and in exchange for that they're willing to build bridges, schools, roads, and a whole raft of industrial industries to help Africa grow. And of course Guineans, who are quite clearly patriotic and very focused on the issue of their raw materials, are quite happy for China to partake in that.
This afternoon, Have you been impressed with what you've heard, and are you expecting much from that address?
Well, on the issue of aid, clearly the industrialized nations are trying to do that much more to Africa. But Africa needs more than that. They need an element of trade, and they need to be able to govern and control their own affairs themselves. On the issue of Obama, Obama clearly going to Ghana is an indication that Ghana is being rewarded for the good practices, that the fact that they've had free and fair elections, they've had good governance, and attracting a lot of foreign direct investment. So it's as a result of those good elements that I've mentioned that Obama is making that trip. But it also signals that other countries like Nigeria, which are the most populous nation on the African continent, are being sidestepped. South Africa will not be so pleased themselves because they are clearly a superpower on the African continent and they're not being looked into. So
right.
It's good brownie points for Ghana all the way, I'm afraid.
Africa expert Ayo Johnson joins me now from our London studio. What's it like, Ayo Johnson, for people in Africa to be watching these convictions going on in Paris?
These arms deals have been going on for some time, and they're looking at it and thinking, well, it's about time that someone is actually found guilty for some of these atrocities, because clearly the arms sales is a billion-dollar industry. It destabilizes regions, it affects governments, it actually keeps politicians in power unnecessarily, it actually controls population, and it impacts directly on communities.
Welcome back. On one of our first shows here at the Listening Post, the conflict has spilled into the media, and President Museveni, once credited with opening up the airwaves, has now silenced 4 of the most popular radio stations in Uganda.
The media as a whole have been curtailed. No reasonable discussions are happening on radio at the moment. It's got to tug a specific line. If we look at what happened in Sierra Leone, we saw something similar, where journalists were arrested, where we had media outlets that were threatened because they thought that they were perpetuating and inciting youths to go on the street and cause anarchy. If it doesn't allow the media to actually have the ability to do their job, then we're going to have outlets who are prepared to go the extra mile and do things clandestinely.
Do other Africans look at Nigeria and say, yes, they're making progress 10 years on?
Well, no.
No.
For the simple reason that Nigeria, be it that because of their might, their numbers, 150-odd million, should have done far better.
Yes.
But in saying
Look at that oil wealth.
Yes.
My
Absolutely.
goodness.
But I'm not a fan of the oil wealth. I've always been on the understanding that with oil, you've got to have other resources that you've got to lean on. To be totally dependent, where you've got 99% of all your income coming from oil, being totally dependent on it is a worry, because you'll be hit when we've got fluctuations in the market, and when prices go down, and when in the case we've got in the Delta region at the moment, where 30% of the output of oil has been curtailed. Literally instantly. It hurts the government. But also, the rest of Africa looks at Nigeria and thinks, well, we thought you guys were a superpower. Clearly you're not.
Yeah.
South Africa has taken that mantle.
Yeah.
You are clearly a distant second. And maybe it may give Nigerians the appetite to do one better.
Well, joining me in the studio for more on this is African Affairs analyst Ayo Johnson. Mr. Johnson, now that these convictions have taken place, do you think there'll be any type of legal reaction in Angola?
Well, one would expect so, but the truth is President Santos, who's got an iron grip on that country, is not going to allow that. And he made that very clear during the trial in France, that he did not want the trial to go ahead. He didn't think that they were founded. He thought that they actually exposed a lot of what had happened back then, and he put a lot of their secrets, especially military secrets from an Angolan perspective, out in the open.